All right, well, welcome to this week's reading. There was something about, as I was thinking about the different readings that we've had over the last couple weeks, this one actually is a really good culmination, in my opinion, of looking at critical reflexive analysis and that understanding of self as how you approach particular issues, situations, understanding what it means to effectively engage with individuals and improving the communication process, I guess, if you will. And then leading into the next week, which was agenda setting, and looking at some of the different aspects of why certain issues are prevalent in today's conversations, not necessarily just in the classroom, but within the media setting as well. But then also social cog theory, and I realized I didn't require that particular reading, but I do think that if you had taken the time to read through those chapters as well as if you are using them in some of your own research or other courses, I have a feeling you're going to see some connections among all of those things into this week's reading. And so I had a very particular reason why I wanted you to read these two pieces. One in particular is because, in my opinion, these two pieces really help to culminate into the essence and the importance of the role of the researcher in a given social science-based project. And specifically, I state the importance of the role of the researcher, especially as it relates to perhaps qualitative work, where you are actually integrating into a community or a target audience, and you personally are interacting with these individuals through in-depth interviews. So regardless of whether or not you come to the point where you are doing quantitative analysis, there is the important discussion that needs to come around to the way in which you conduct yourself and how you integrate and enter into these communities. So that is really the point of what I wanted to try to get at this week. And of course, these two pieces are very near and dear to me, as they are both projects that I worked on. One with the chapter specifically, which is the Dada chapter that you read, was actually a project that I worked on while I was in my PhD program. And it effectively, honestly, that particular course changed the whole direction of my research agenda, period, and has really transformed how I approach social science in general now. But the thing about what makes this important is that when you look at these particular pieces, the chapter and the article, the point that I want to challenge you with is the role that you play as the researcher, but even potentially as the communicator, whether you officially claim that role or not, in the classroom or the community, based on a given project, or at which point you are even entering into the community to begin with. But more than anything, it's about recognizing the discursive space that exists. And I don't know that I've necessarily talked so much about that particular term in the past, but if you're not familiar with that use of the word discursive space, it really encapsulates this idea of the point at which a conversation takes place, and not just the typical conversation like we would define it, where you and I may be having a conversation, or we will have a conversation in a classroom, or even orally we're having a conversation within a community setting. But sometimes the discursive space is the place in which meaning is transferred, truths are held, and so it can be part of what is defined as culture. Each community has its unique culture that exists that help to define kind of that discursive space that continually goes on. It's where the held meanings exist. It's where you recognize accepted practices. That in and of itself becomes this discursive space. So getting specifically into the chapter on the voices of hunger, this one, as I mentioned, was a project that I worked on, and it looks specifically at food insecurity at the local level, specifically through local food pantries. Honestly, I have to say that when I go back and read through this chapter, it's probably not one of my favorites in terms of quality. I can clearly see the voices of the 5 students who worked on the project come out in the context of the chapter, and so from the quality level of the writing, it could have been much better, but I think the most important thing to take away from it is the value and the essence of the project. So, if anything out of this particular chapter, what I want to be able to do with you is introduce you to this framework, the theoretical framework known as the culture-centered approach, or how most often it is referred to as CCA. Now, I know that I've had a conversation with a number of you, and I've actually brought this particular framework up in our discussion, specifically as it relates to some of your research interests. So, some of you may be familiar with this, others this may be the first time you've heard about the culture-centered approach. But again, what this does is it really brings it back around to the role of the researcher in terms of a social science and even communication-based project. To kind of place a sense of context for you as we continue to explore this area of culture-centered approach, I would say if it fits with any family that we've already done, it definitely kind of in some ways would be that next iteration of participatory rule appraisal. And what I mean by that, and the fact is that you're entering into that grassroots level, that local community. But what differentiates participatory rule appraisal with the culture-centered approach is that CCA really takes on more of this activist approach in the end. It's not necessarily about going in and allowing the community to talk and you glean information from them, but ultimately the goal is to create these coalition, or I should say it's a coalition building among the community members to help understand what are the issues. But instead of being the catalyst for change as a researcher, the catalyst of change is placed in the hands of the community members, of the participants. CCA is really built and designed specifically for communities who are more on the margins of society, so we would refer to them as more of these marginalized audiences, marginalized communities. Oftentimes, I would also associate what is oftentimes referred to in the literature as underserved populations. And of course, clearly this can fit into the area of minority populations, but also low-income populations as well. So the point of this particular project was really geared toward looking at and examining critically the lived experiences of food pantry clients at the local level. So in this case, it was based out of Lafayette, Indiana. But the intent was to really examine critically their lived experiences, but more importantly, to be able to look at it more critically in the context of the overarching structure. Where do they exist, and how is it that everything that surrounds them has either an impact positively or negatively on their lived experiences? So what do I mean by this? Well, okay, so if you're going to look at CCA, there are 3 guiding constructs that exist within CCA. It is structure, culture, and agency. Those particular constructs are the absolute most essential pieces within this framework. And to be able to define them a bit more for you, the fact is that culture, first and foremost, is, and it's truly why it is recognized as a culture-centered approach. But first of all, you have to define culture. And the thing about culture is that you can look at a number of different disciplines, and culture is defined in a number of different ways. But in this particular case, you're pulling from more of that anthropological understanding of culture, and you're going to define it from the standpoint of it is the held meanings. So again, I go back to that discursive space from a communications standpoint. The held meanings, the traditions, the practices, just the way of in everyday living that goes about, and looking at, as a group, as a community, we associate ourselves together through our collective and shared culture. Then you're going to look at this area of structure. Now, in this particular instance, as it relates to the culture-centered approach, you have to take on this understanding that structure specifically is going to be looking at, if you have culture, you have to recognize that you have lots of cultures that are going on around us at any given moment. And I would say even within the context of the building here at work, you're going to have undergraduate students, graduate students, staff, and faculty, and honestly, you could look at 4 different cultures right there. 4, not 5. 4 different cultures right there that really differentiate themselves, but collectively we could still all come together and have shared meanings through the context of the department itself. Now, that was a very simplistic description of culture, but that helps to understand kind of these different levels and iterations of structure that exist. It's kind of what dictates how we live, the policies that guide us, the knowledge that is accepted and shared. I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden, but then also some of the different ongoing practices and expectations. Now, take it to another level when it comes to structure. We can look at the university as a structure. It is an institution that is a knowledge producer. It is instituting expectations, rules, and practices that transcend down to all of us who are part of this system. The institution itself also determines what knowledge that is produced is disseminated out to the local level, to the community, throughout the state, and beyond. The institution controls how that information is shared. The institution determines what is accepted and what is not. What we have to recognize is that utilizing the university as as an example of that structure, as the dominant structure, is that we ourselves are products of that institution, of that structure. And so therefore we are personally affected by the knowledge, by the expectations, the practices that go on. And so because of that, there is this sense of a status quo that is maintained, the expectation that is there. The institution maintains that status quo. Now, I gave you the university as an example, but you can utilize that from any standpoint within a given community, the leadership and the government at the local level, government at the national level. So again, we can see when it comes to culture, culture is affected by structure based on the fact that it helps to determine what we do and what we don't do, what we expect and examine and assume are the practices that we do on a daily basis. Then you're going to have agency that is at play. Now, agency, while it's not an overly intuitive term, the purpose behind agency is to recognize that each of us individually have access to given resources. All of us typically have the ability to access healthcare, food, education, but oftentimes the ability to access those things are determined by the socioeconomic levels in which we exist, the privileges that are granted to us based on our position within the given structure. And so therefore, when you consider CCA, or the culture-centered approach, you recognize that individuals or groups who are on the margins typically have less agency. And so because of that, they have less access to given resources that are determined and defined by the dominant structure. They also have, I guess what I should say then is that their agency, where we have and are able to practice internal agency because we believe we have access to it, we do have access to it, so therefore we determine how we're going to utilize that information, those resources, and those opportunities. Whereas individuals or groups who are on the margins, who are underserved or low income, and they have low agency, that agency is oftentimes recognized as being external. It's not them who determines how they access, when they can access, and how much they can access. It is the external structure that determines that. So, what I have done is to help you just to at least see is that when you look at structure, culture, and agency, again, these are the three central constructs of the culture-centered approach. What you recognize is that you've got three constructs that are continually intersecting with each other, always. So in some form or fashion, they're always intersecting with each other. But the way to be able to even think about that even more critically is the fact that they are oftentimes in this contested intersection of sorts. What they do is that the structure and agency is really at odds, specifically in the marginalized communities, and culture as a result is affected because of it. And in some ways, structure defines more of the culture than the agency of the individuals define their culture. That is trying to describe it fairly simply. I hope that makes sense to an extent. But again, let me reiterate too, is that as the researcher in a given project, we are part of that dominant paradigm. We are part of we are part of the knowledge production process. And because of that, we have to recognize that as a researcher, specifically if you are intending to engage with underserved populations, that you personally are in a privileged position. Now again, that could be a whole different discussion altogether, and I think that would be fantastic to talk about at some point. But nonetheless, we are privileged in our positions in which we hold. So because of that, what CCA demands is that you step out of that dominant paradigm. You step out of that structure. And when you do that, you recognize your biases that you hold. And again, this pulls in the critical reflexive analysis. You recognize the biases that you hold, you step out, and you're willing to turn around and critically deconstruct where you just came from. You look at the varying practices that exist, you look at the common terms that are used and the types of resources available, and you are willing to critically deconstruct to ask the questions of, why do we do what we do? Why is that accepted practice? Why are we engaging with that particular audience in that particular way? What may come out of it is that you recognize that those are truly legitimate things, that is okay. But that willingness to turn around and look at that critically allows you to have more of that authentic view, and not necessarily always kind of taking the epistemologies that we have personally and within the institution for granted. That we're also willing to say, you know what, maybe it's not quite the way that it should be, and how could we potentially improve that? So, the other thing that being able and willing to step out as the researcher from that critical paradigm is it gives you more of an opportunity to more authentically integrate with and engage with the target audience. And in turn, it challenges you, again, through critical reflexive analysis, to be able to commit to, and to in turn almost, well, I shouldn't say almost, your goal should be to kind of establish this solidarity with the target audience. And in this case, it was with the food insecure individuals, the clients of the food pantries. And from there, you're able to move to this process of developing a co-constructed narrative with the food pantry clients. So you, as the researcher engaging through in-depth interviews, are able to co-construct the narratives or the lived experiences of these individuals. So it was really through in-depth interviews that we had with the food pantry clients that allowed us to find the entry point. And we had to determine, first of all, what was our entry point going to be. The entry point for us was a simple question. What does hunger mean to you? And you know, the interesting thing is that I know I've talked with some of you about just the process of interviewing and the developing of questions as it relates to a potential interview. But we utilize grounded theory, which I'll talk about more in a moment. using a few guiding questions, and one of them was, what does hunger mean to you? And honestly, for some interviews, that was the only question that we had to ask, and the individual just ran with it and started having a conversation with us. Now, it's not that that's the only thing we asked and we let the rest of it go, but instead, as the interviewer who's going in and utilizing grounded theory, you go in with a very slim set of questions with the intent that the individual is going to lead the discussion. As they lead it, you're able to also identify very particular points that they bring up that you could have not predicted or planned for otherwise. So by doing that and listening very carefully, you're able to pick up and ask additional questions that probe a little further and go a little deeper and allow you to reveal things that are incredibly important as it relates to issues with food insecurity. The other thing that comes out of these interviews is moving into this idea of work groups or focus groups. And so what we did was, once we identified, we did 25 different interviews, and from those interviews, then we distilled it down to about 6 individuals who are willing to continue with us in the project. We brought them together in work groups, and the point of being able to do that was we identified very specific themes that began to emerge out of the original interviews. And we brought those back to the smaller group discussion for the purposes of being able to let them decide if those truly were very relevant, let them or allow them to expand on those particular themes, and then even identify new ones that perhaps had gone by the wayside or were not discussed previously. The whole point of all of this, and again, keep this in mind as it relates to the culture-centered approach, is that the point of engaging specifically with this community was for the purpose of disrupting the discursive space. So, again, as I already described, that discursive space is oftentimes led by the dominant paradigm. And so therefore, by integrating the food insecure or the food pantry clients into the discussion, the purpose was to be able to make change more authentic because it is grounded in that local community as opposed to working from that top-down approach. So now, because of that, what you're doing is the purpose is to be able to negotiate multiple worldviews that exist. And again, the dominant paradigm or the dominant structure is going to have very particular worldviews in terms of how you define certain situations, how we understand certain things. But again, you bring in the local community, much like we would in the participatory role appraisal. We bring those into the discursive space to be able to say, this is what we have always done, this is our common epistemology, but let's shake it up a little bit and allow these individuals to be part of the conversation. So I've kind of given you a quick overview of the project structure itself. And so, I would say that while the chapter that I had you read doesn't necessarily identify what we gained out of it personally, at least in terms of the role of the researcher, I will say that going through this process for me had a profound impact in how I viewed my role as a researcher. All of a sudden, something that I had really not thought about very carefully before, I began to kind of develop this inherent sense of responsibility as it related to just how much I could potentially have an impact on a given community. And I don't necessarily mean from a positive standpoint. You go into some of these situations with the intent and really good intentions of making amazing transformation and lifting communities up out of hardships. But ultimately, it can also be that the role that I have or the impact that I have could be very negative if I'm not handling it well and portraying information in a very responsible and ethical sort of approach. For anybody, and I can distinctly remember being told in our conversations within the class of culture-centered approach, to take this kind of framework on develops this immense responsibility of recognizing that if your role is to be able to target and work with a low-income population, that you could have profound impacts on this population, some of them that you are not necessarily realizing that you're having. And so I thought to myself, this is an area that I'm passionate about, but I want to make sure that I'm doing it well too. And this particular framework really helps to kind of work through some of those steps and kind of keep you in check personally. So the other thing that I mentioned earlier is that CCA uses a theoretical methodology called grounded theory. And hold on just a second. So many of you may have heard of grounded theory. Perhaps you've even used it to an extent. But there's a fantastic book. It's called Constructing Grounded Theory, A Practical Guide Through Qualitative Analysis. It's by Kathy Charmaz. This is a great read, I think, specifically because she does a very, I wouldn't say it's real easy, but it does give a very clear guide to using grounded theory. The thing about grounded theory is that it really kind of gives you this chance of being able to go into interviews very semi-structured, kind of with a basic guide of some of the things that you want to identify or explore with the participant. You're identifying a very particular entry point. Like for us, we were interested in, what does hunger mean to you? But the point is that you don't just go through all of the interviews and then once you're finished with every single interview, you go back and do the analysis. Instead, it is a bit intensive in the fact that when you're finished with one interview, you analyze it, identify some of the key things that were starting to emerge out of it, and then take some of those things into the next interview with you. So you're continually refining that interview process, and which allows you to go deeper and deeper and deeper into some of the issues that, again, you could have never planned for or predicted prior to going into those particular interviews. So when we did those 25 interviews, we brought 6 individuals together, identified some of the themes, let them discuss them a little bit more, but then what we did is then we instilled this process of Photovoice, and that's clearly what the other article focuses on. And I won't go into too much detail at this moment with that, other than the fact that specifically with this project, what we did is we gave them cameras, we let them take pictures of, what does hunger mean to you? They identified, the obstacles, the different things that they deal with. They brought them back. We had a couple hundred photos that we were sifting through. We let them go through as a group, identify which ones they feel like best reflected what their experiences were as it relates to hunger. And then those particular photos were placed into, they were blown up, placed in a photo exhibit, and held in a community forum where we invited the food bank director, local media, and other individuals who have roles in the community as it relates to addressing hunger or food insecure issues. So those individuals within our coalition group came and they shared their experiences. They talked about their personal stories, and it opened up a dialogue, and it disrupted that discursive space. It created a different conversation around food insecurity as opposed to just remaining within that dominant paradigm. So for them, they identified very key struggles. There was a stigma of going to the food bank the food pantry altogether. It's, some of them, they were not going there all the time. They've not been clients long term. It was a temporary sort of thing for them because of job loss issues. So there was a significant stigma of realizing I have to go to a food pantry, and I never thought that I would have to. There's also this idea of variable food available to them. Of course, the food pantry and the food bank identifies the fact that they have very specific sources that they get food. And sometimes the variety cannot be planned, it's just whatever is available. But for some of these individuals, it says a lot about their personal identity based on what kind of food they feel is relegated to them as kind of the what's not wanted anymore. It's the leftovers, it's the dented cans, it's the, hey, I was doing a food drive and I pulled out the things in the very back of my pantry that I don't want anymore, but I'll donate it to the food pantry. Well, these individuals saw it that way too, and they felt that way. And so for them, that again led and kind of contributed to the stigma. And the other thing was transportation. Sometimes just trying to get to the available food pantries was really difficult. So again, bringing some of these issues to the table for disrupting the discursive space was incredibly important. All right, so let's transition over to the Photovoice article. And that one in particular came out of a dissertation, or out of my dissertation project, where I focused on the lived experiences of FNEP participants. FNEP, if you're not familiar with it, is known as the Expanded Food, Nutrition, and Education Program that comes out of Extension, and it's geared toward mostly women, but also families that have small children, and it's really intended to help bolster good nutrition among food preparation as well as budgeting for food planning over the course of a given month. My interest was looking at, what does good nutrition mean to them, and how effective are we actually engaging with them through the FNEP program. So I interviewed 15 participants in the program, but I also not only interviewed the participants, but also to identify the different levels of the structure, I interviewed all of the paraprofessionals who deliver the program at the local level, which was in the Indianapolis area. There's about 8 of them, and then I also interviewed all of the individuals who are administrators of the program at the county level on up to the university level. So for me, the entry point with the participants was, what does good nutrition mean to you? For the entry point into the paraprofessionals as well as the administrators, the question was, what does effective engagement mean to you? So to me, I needed to understand what were the participants getting personally out of it, what did they want to get out of it, what did the paraprofessionals and the administrators think that they were doing well and determine as being effective engagement. So overall, the data collection, I know it was fairly intensive, but looking at all of the interviews individually and then bringing together of the 15 participants, I did have about 8 of them participate in work groups, so utilizing Photovoice. And then I also did observations, so an ethnographic side of the study, which was observing one participant for 8 weeks, which was the duration of the entire program. So I would go with the paraprofessional to this woman's house, and I would sit and observe the program being delivered to her and her interaction with the paraprofessional and so forth. But then I also incorporated every step of the way critical reflexive analysis of my personal role and how I was dealing with each step as well as each interview. So it was always identify what is the struck by moment that I'm having and how am I kind of interpreting it, as well as utilizing that information in moving forward. Could I have done any of that project with just one set of data collection and minus everything else? I would say absolutely and positively no. And I will explain to you why here in a moment. The themes that came out of the Photovoice only. Now keep in mind I did all of the interviews first. When I did the Photovoice, this is when I brought some of the reoccurring themes from the interviews into the work group session. They confirmed, they denied, they refined, but then when I had them do Photovoice, where I gave them cameras and I said, okay, go and take pictures of whatever you think helps to portray what does good nutrition mean to you. What I found was that from that process and then bringing those pictures back into the discussion, there were 2 different things that were incredibly telling to me. I'd already done all of the interviews, so in my mind I had a good understanding of who these people were and what their lived experiences were. So I'm trying to be authentic, engage, and develop a sense of solidarity with them. But what I found is that prior to giving those photos back to them, I actually sat down and looked through all of the photos personally myself. And I went through, and based on what I knew of them, I was making assumptions on what I assumed that those pictures meant and what they would be telling me later in the work group. What I found in a following discussion with them, that I was way off on a number of different things, and to me that was an incredibly sobering thought, especially as it relates to my role as the researcher and what that meant. I was wrong, and my knowledge and understanding of this group to this point clearly became evident that it was lacking. And so what came out of the Photovoice, based on what they shared, were there were 2 additional themes that came out that would have never come out in the interviews alone. One was the fact that all of the participants in this particular group were all residents of a transitional housing complex in downtown Indianapolis. And what they revealed during the Photovoice discussion was that they were dealing with frustrations and obstacles of living in a downtown food desert. Even though a local grocery store was only 2 blocks away from them, Kroger, what they found was that Kroger actually prohibited the application of the knowledge that they were learning in the program, because at the end of the month, when they were low on dollars on their EBT card with food stamps, that the store would actually increase prices, or they wouldn't honor some of their coupons that they would do, like triple coupons. The individuals shared with me experience after experience of when they would go in there and they would feel this extreme stigma. They would be told, nope, you can't use that, sorry, even though they knew for a fact that they could, but they, feeling like they had low agency, would give up and walk away, or would just be frustrated about it. The other thing that came out was the skewed meaning of ownership of issues. And again, this comes back to the sense of agency. You know, to me, it would be a matter of, in the course of the discussion, I would say, based on what they were saying, I would offer up a potential solution. And while they would get excited about it at first, then they would get hesitant. And I know I mentioned this in the article, but they would say, one woman would say to me, you mean you think that we can, or that you can? So she would hesitate. It's almost like she started to sense agency, that they could actually do something, but then she'd pull it back and say, or you can do it for us. You know, you could have that role. And again, that was very telling to me to realize these are significant obstacles. So to go in with that solution and just say, here, do this, sometimes that's not even an option. So it's more than saying that we're going to make a change and encouraging them to take ownership, because their agency is already low. So part of it is going through this process of trying to figure out with them, how do we change that? How can they change that? What does that look like, and what does that mean? From a communication standpoint, it is important to enter into the discursive space, their discursive space with this audience. But not only that, we also need to be able to disrupt the discursive space of the dominant paradigm. And so, you know, when that particular portion of the project was over, much like we did in the Voices of Hunger project, we had a community forum where we invited the administrators who I'd interviewed, brought them into the discussion, and allowed them to share their experiences. The program participants to share their experiences as it related to obstacles that they faced, particularly at the grocery store specifically. And it was interesting to watch the dynamics of the administrators with the participants, because in many ways you could see some of the that contested intersection at play, with a structure of saying, well, this is kind of what we do, so there's really nothing else. I'm not sure what else we can identify. But then you have the participants saying, yes, I realize that nutrition is really important, and I greatly embrace everything I learn, but there's a number of obstacles in my life that prohibit my ability to do that, such as the grocery store, the fact that I have a lot of medical issues, I'm dealing with child services on a weekly basis. I have to set nutrition as a periphery issue and not as a priority given the circumstance of other things. Okay, and so then I guess the other thing that I think is really important to point out is that from a communicator standpoint, we value the words of the individuals. Of course we do. But sometimes we don't know how to more effectively value that. What do we do with that understanding? And I think Photovoice enables that alternative approach. I would have never, ever heard anything about Kroger if I had not conducted the Photovoice component of the project. That never came up in the context of the in-depth interviews. But once one person brought it up, then all of a sudden it just revealed an entire situation that had otherwise not been addressed. The other thing about photos is that when you give a participant, especially underserved or marginalized members of the population, you give them a camera and you just give them very basic instructions. Show me, in your experiences, what does trying to achieve good nutrition look like? When you remove them from that formalized interview process, you give them a sense of freedom where they are uninhibited to be able to take photos and just kind of work on their own. And I know some of you have probably done some reading in literature that talks about kind of that dynamic between the researcher and the participant of a project. That sometimes there's these biases that take place, or they will shield some of their answers in a way because they will answer a question based on what they think you want to hear as opposed to what the reality actually is. Photos kind of drew some of those things out a bit more. The other thing is that, again, it revealed issues that probably never would have otherwise been brought up. But more importantly, what it did is, I think from the standpoint of that particular grocery store, it revealed something that then, had I had more time, the next step would have been to re-enter into the field of research and begin looking more critically at the grocery store. So identifying these senses of injustices that exist, these communication practices that go on in terms of removing access to certain resources, controlling it in ways that we would most of the time, most of us would not even fathom would even be an issue, but it really is. So again, this whole area of just recognizing how do we re-engage with the community, and trying to also look at, sometimes we can't just focus on nutrition in this instance or something else. We have to be willing to look at the greater picture and all of the different variables involved. In that respect, I think CCA specifically could really have a potential to be in more of a longitudinal form. So you engage in a given community, and over a series of years, you look to see what the type of the outcomes that can take place because of that continual investment and commitment to a given community and that researcher's role in it. Personally, I find something like that incredibly fascinating. It's quite arduous. It's overwhelming. I think from the standpoint of the researcher, it's one of those things where you can sit there and also say, what in the world am I doing? This is ridiculous. But at the same point, it's a very interesting way to be able to better understand a given community. But again, tying it back to communication too, the one thing I will end on is the fact that through these different collections of data, it does look at the researcher's role in terms of my ability personally to listen. It's one thing to hear what somebody's saying. It's another thing to hear it and then make an assumption on what they meant, and then dictate research based on your assumptions. And that can be very dangerous. So in some ways, it's a matter of recognizing that we honestly have an inherent inability to listen well. That there is this need to have more of a humility of recognizing I'm not a great listener because I'm constantly placing my own biases on trying to figure out what's next, or creating a solution and moving on. And sometimes you can't do that quite so quickly. You have to be willing to step back and not just analyze them, but you personally and how you are understanding a given situation. All right, well, I look forward to seeing what you have to say online, and I appreciate your attention to this, and I hope the audio is okay. But again, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks, and I'll